Wanted to make sure Bill Johnson was back.
Karen will be here, but that's your opening statement.
Yeah. Get that yesterday. Good morning, Mr. Shimkus. So the subcommittee is going to come to order, and the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Before we get started, I want to wish our friend Dan Schneider, where's Dan? There he is. One of our press secretaries, farewell. He's been here 3 years. This is his last week at Energy and Commerce. He did a wonderful job in that role for me as chair of the full committee, and he's continued to do a terrific job under Chairman Walden. Thank you for your hard work. We look forward to seeing you again, but not with your hand up like that. So anyway, welcome. Thank you. So today's markup is going to include 5 important energy bills addressing cyber, emergency preparedness, energy security. All 5 bills are bipartisan and build upon the committee's impressive record of oversight, hearings, and previously enacted bills aimed at protecting and strengthening our nation's energy infrastructure. I want to start by focusing my comments on one of the bills that we're calling up today, H.R. 5175, the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, which I introduced with Mr. Loebsack. And as we've learned in classified hearings and a good number of other events, certainly through the recent testimonies of Secretary Perry and FERC commissioners, cyber attacks are a real and a growing threat. To quote Secretary Perry, as the nation's top 100 pipelines alone supply nearly 84% of the nation's energy, pipelines represent a critical part of North America's energy backbone. A coordinated government approach to the cyber and physical security of pipelines led by DOE is essential to ensuring the safe and reliable flow of energy across the U.S. So my intent with this legislation is to strengthen DOE's role to coordinate cyber response, collaborate, and build capacity within states in the energy sector. This is not a regulatory program, and we're not authorizing DOE to develop mandatory minimum standards. The bill is about conducting research, communicating threats, and coordinating the response across government. Today's markup will include 4 other bills focused on these same themes, including a bill introduced by Mr. Wahlberg and Rush that updates the DOE Organization Act to strengthen its emergency response capabilities. Mr. Latta and McNerney have taken the lead on 2 important bills related to the cyber of our nation's electricity grid. H.R. 5239, the Cyber Sense Act, establishes a voluntary DOE that tests the cybersecurity of products and technologies intended for use in the bulk power system. H.R. 5240, the Enhancing Grid Security Through Public-Private Partnerships Act, requires DOE to establish a program to facilitate and encourage public-private partnerships to promote and advance the physical and cyber security of our electric utilities that have fewer resources due to the size or region. And finally, Mr. Johnson's bill, which will streamline DOE's process for approving small-scale shipments of LNG, which will open up new markets in the Caribbean, Central America, South America for cleaner burning natural gas. Collectively, these bills represent an important step in the right direction in better protecting our nation's energy infrastructure against cyber and physical threats and strengthening our nation's security. I want to thank all members for their work, and I recognize Mr. Rush for an opening statement.
All right, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is a critical markup today on legislation addressing cybersecurity and any emergency response issues, as well as on H.R. 4606, which deals with small-scale LNG projects. I support the 4 cybersecurity bills that are before us, and they would help to address one of the most pressing issues we face, protecting our energy grid from those who might wish to do us harm. In fact, Mr. Chairman, as you know, in our hearing with the commissioners just yesterday, Chairman McIntyre cited cybersecurity issues as one of the biggest concerns confronting him and the agency. So, Mr. Chairman, I would like to commend all the sponsors and the co-sponsors of the cybersecurity bills being marked up today for their thoughtful attention to this critical issue. I want to specifically acknowledge Mr. Wahlberg of Michigan for working with my office on the Energy Emergency Leadership Act. As you know, Mr. Chairman, this bill will establish a new DOE Assistant Secretary position with jurisdiction over all energy, emergency, and security functions related to energy supply, infrastructure, and cyber security. With all the focus on protecting our electric infrastructure, I believe it is fitting and appropriate to elevate the person responsible for this task up to the Assistant Secretary level at the Department of Energy. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that all 5 of these bills were had bipartisan agreement, but unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I'm not able to support H.R. 4606, the Ensuring Small-Scale Energy Certainty and Access Act. This bill would amend Section 3C of the National Gas Act to consider application for exports of small volumes of natural gas consisting of 0.14 billion cubic feet per day or less to be in the public interest. This bill appears to be nothing but a pretty obvious legislative earmark, and I cannot support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Plone from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee will consider 4 cybersecurity bills and 1 bill addressing liquefied natural gas exports. I was hoping this would be a bipartisan markup of consensus cybersecurity legislation, but unfortunately, the majority added the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act to this markup just before it was noticed, and that is a bill I can't support. The 4 bipartisan cybersecurity bills before us today will enhance the Department of Energy's efforts to strengthen the cybersecurity of our nation's electricity grid and pipeline network. It's critical that we ensure our nation's energy infrastructure is sufficiently protected from cyber threats. And I support these 4 bipartisan bills and commend my colleagues who have taken leadership on this issue. But the small-scale LNG bill is another situation. My opposition to LNG exports is probably no surprise to anyone. I've long voiced my concern that an unrestricted export policy could significantly impact domestic natural gas prices and adversely affect American consumers and manufacturers. This bill appears to be an attempt to codify the Trump administration's recently proposed rule to expedite the approval of small-scale natural gas exports. In my opinion, that rule is already problematic, but this bill is even worse for the environment than the proposed rule. Let me speak to that. It would allow expedited approval of small LNG facilities so long as the proposal is below a certain threshold and does not require an environmental review under NEPA. That's the Trump administration rule. And that rule is also a concerning carve-out for a subset of LNG applications. Specifically, it declares that all small-scale exports are always in the public interest, removes long-standing consumer protections, and prevents the public from having an opportunity to know about or provide input on export proposals. But despite its flaws, the administration's small-scale LNG rule is a far better option than this legislation, which would keep the volume limit but completely abandon the requirement that applications qualify for a categorical exclusion from NEPA. In other words, this bill would allow for the approval of facilities that would currently undergo serious environmental review, and I adamantly oppose any efforts to remove these environmental protections. So leave it to the Republican leadership of this committee to mark up a bill that has even fewer environmental safeguards than the Trump administration's proposal. So who's going to benefit from this legislation? According to the Congressional Research Service, only one project currently meets the capacity requirements of the administration's small-scale LNG rule, but does not qualify for a categorical exclusion, and that's Eagle LNG Partners in Jacksonville. It's essentially a private bill, an earmark, which I thought Republicans opposed. I brought this up during our legislative hearing, and still to this day, no one's been able to explain why this particular project deserves such special treatment. I'm still waiting for an answer. So, Mr. Chairman, I think that bill is unnecessary, it's bad policy, and it's a legislative earmark. We should not advance it to the full committee, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, for an opening statement.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for this markup, and the 5 bipartisan bills, I think, reflect 2 key themes in our DOE modernization effort: ensuring the Department of Energy has the tools it needs to execute its core energy security mission, and reorienting DOE's approach toward domestic energy infrastructure to capitalize on our nation's energy abundance. The potential for cyber attacks by foreign nations and other actors against our nation's business and energy systems highlights one of the significant and growing threats to the reliable supply of energy in the United States. When you consider the rapid deployment of digital technology, the interconnected nature of our oil and gas and electricity systems, and the role of electricity across all sectors of our domestic economy, DOE's responsibilities for ensuring the reliable delivery of energy is much more complicated than the fuel supply disruptions of the late 1970s. We've heard from Secretary Perry and the FERC commissioners that we can and should do more to combat cyber threats to our nation's energy infrastructure. 4 of the bills we will consider today take practical steps to ensure the Department of Energy can more effectively carry out its emergency and security activities in the energy sector and ensure the continued safe and reliable flow of energy across the United States. H.R. 5174, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act by Mr. Wahlberg and Ranking Member Rush, elevates the leadership of DOE's emergency response and cybersecurity operations to the Assistant Secretary level, which reflects the importance of this mission across the department and in interagency coordination. H.R. 5175, the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cybersecurity Preparedness Act by Chairman Upton and Mr. Loebsack, establishes DOE's leadership in coordinating the government and energy sector's approach to cyber and physical security of pipelines. And H.R. 5239, the Cyber Sense Act by Chairman Latta and Mr. McNerney, establishes a voluntary program to help utilities and other stakeholders identify and promote cybersecure products for use in the bulk power grid and industrial control systems. And H.R. 5240, the Enhancing Grid Security Through Public-Private Partnership Act, also introduced by Mr. McNerney and Mr. Latta, would help bring DOE's technical know-how through public-private partnerships to help improve the cybersecurity of electric utilities, especially those utilities that have fewer resources due to their size or region of the country. Finally, turning to the energy abundance issue, we're also considering H.R. 4606, Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act, introduced by Mr. Johnson. This bipartisan bill would codify a proposed DOE regulation to encourage small shipments of LNG to countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, putting small-scale LNG exports on a level playing field with pipeline exports to Canada and Mexico. So taken together, these bills represent important energy security and energy infrastructure reforms that will better position the Department of Energy to serve the nation's interests going forward. I commend our members for working on this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support these measures. And Mr. Chairman, before I yield back, I want to draw special attention and thank you for the service of Dan Schneider, who has been a terrific member of our committee staff for the last 3 years, and will be leaving. He's been a real important part of our communications team, and in fact, I think he's the longest serving member of the communications team. And while we hate to see him leave, we're excited for his new opportunity, and so I hope the committee will join me in thanking Dan for his service to the Energy and Commerce Committee.
The chair would remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Are there further opening statements? Mr. Latta is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the chairman for holding today's markup. I'm pleased to see the markup of 2 bills I've introduced and worked on closely with Congressman McNerney. The first being H.R. 5239, the CyberSense Act, and the second, H.R. 5240, the Enhancing Grid Security Through Public-Private Partnerships Act. H.R. 5239 directs the Secretary of Energy to establish a voluntary CyberSense program to test the cybersecurity of products and technologies intended for use in the bulk power system. At recent subcommittee hearings, both Secretary Perry and the FERC commissioners expressed support for this policy as a way to help improve the grid's resiliency. We are also considering H.R. 5240, which would direct DOE to facilitate and encourage public-private partnerships in order to improve cybersecurity of electric utilities. These bills will foster a collaborative relationship between DOE and the utilities to ensure that our grid becomes increasingly resilient in the face of cyber attacks. Again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the markup today and look forward to moving these bills.
Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chair. I'm going to basically say the same thing Bob Latta did, but I'm going to say it anyway. And I thank the chairman and the ranking member for their leadership on the bills we have before us today. I've worked closely with my colleague Bob Latta on both of the CyberSense Act and the Enhanced Grid Security Through Public-Private Partnership Act. These bills work to ensure that our grid is protected against cyber attacks. We have recently seen how vulnerable our society and internet are to foreign interference. If an outside entity were to attack our electrical grid, we could go dark without electricity for months. CyberSense requires the Department of Energy to determine a testing process for CyberSense products and to establish a cybersecurity vulnerability reporting process and database, though currently a voluntary program. I hope the public and private energy holders recognize the importance of being secure against cyber threats. The Enhancing Grid Security Through Public-Private Partnership Act provides cybersecurity training to electric utilities and promotes sharing best practices and data collection in the electric sector. While this is also voluntary, I hope that if it proves successful, Congress will fund this program in the future. It also instructs the Secretary to update the Internet Cost Estimate Calculator at least every 2 years. This calculator is used by electric utilities in planning for interruption costs and estimating cost benefits associated with the reliability investments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4606, ensuring small-scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. There's interest and potential in the Caribbean and Central America for American LNG, although not in the large quantities that the current large-scale domestic exporting facilities were built to address. Creating regulatory certainty around small-scale exports will help encourage industries involved in this technology to strongly consider further investments and new opportunities. This bill is about helping to fully realize that potential and can bring about positive geopolitical, economic, and even environmental benefits as Venezuelan fuel oil is displaced, which has been used to gain influence in the region. This should not be a partisan vote. The previous administration recognized the need for U.S. energy engagement with its creation of the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. This bill helps achieve these goals. Lastly, H.R. 4606 is about updating the Natural Gas Act, which currently does not differentiate between large and small-scale LNG projects. In this day and age, when the U.S. has become the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas, does that really still make sense? I think not, Mr. Chairman, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this important bill. I yield back.
Other members wishing to speak? Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're marking up four different cybersecurity bills that will strengthen the grid and our country's security in a variety of ways. We're also considering H.R. 4606, the Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. H.R. 5174, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act by Mr. Walberg and Mr. Rush would create a new Assistant Secretary of DOE tasked with overseeing all energy emergency and security functions related to the energy supply, infrastructure, and cybersecurity. A coordinated approach to these issues will help us defend against the new emerging cyber threats we've seen in the last year, and I support the bill and thank both our colleagues, Mr. Wahlberg and our ranking member, Rush, for their hard work. H.R. 5175, the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cyber Security Preparedness Act by our chair of our committee and Representative Loebsack, would establish a program that further strengthens the physical and cyber security of the natural gas transmission and distribution system in our country. I support that bill. Representative Latta and Representative McNerney Cyber Sense Act of 2018 would create a voluntary cyber sense program in DOE to identify cyber-secure products that could be used in the bulk power system, and I support the bill. I also support H.R. 5240, the enhancing grid security through public-private partnerships. This security of the grid cannot be guaranteed by the federal government alone. A cooperative effort is the best way to forward in ensuring secure energy security for all Americans. Unfortunately, at this point, I cannot support the last bill being considered, H.R. 4606, Ensuring Small-Scale LNG Certainty and Access Act. The bill would codify the recently proposed program at DOE, which expedites the export of LNG from small-scale facilities. I'm a proponent of this DOE program, but this bill removes protections that are currently in place at the department. The Department of Energy currently requires any small-scale LNG facility that wants to use this expedited approval to qualify for this categorical exclusion under DOE's National Environmental Policy Act regulations. As it's currently written, this protection will no longer be required, and it is for this reason I cannot support the bill in its current form. I hope to clarify here that I'm a big supporter of LNG. I want to support this bill, and I think the rule at DOE is a well-balanced approach, and I wish the legislation reflected that. I hope the majority will work with me on this issue so the bill might move forward in the future in a bipartisan basis. It's possible to remove barriers that increase competition for small-scale operators in the LNG market while still following standard environmental regulations. I thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair would recognize Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot has changed in cyber and in energy since Mr. Latta was born on this day many years ago. And I'm glad to see. We need
At least his time has not expired yet.
I was going to say that, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to see this committee is taking a hard look at cybersecurity at DOE. My colleague, Mr. Rush, and I introduced H.R. 5174, the Energy Emergency Leadership Act. This is a bipartisan and practical amendment to DOE's core statute to elevate DOE's energy security emergency functions to a level in agency leadership that is reflective of its importance across the agency, the government, and the nation. DOE is creating a new Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, which the Secretary plans to assign to an Assistant Secretary. Our bill complements this effort while recognizing that because this energy emergency mission will remain vital to the nation for years to come, it should be established in the Department of Energy Organization Act so we can have continuity of leadership through future administrations with the appropriate level of accountability. I urge its support, and thanks to the chairman for bringing it up. And I yield back.
I'm yield back. Other members wishing to give an opening statement? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson.
Very briefly, for the record, Rhea Latta works at my alma mater, Rice University. She just sent me a text message to tell the committee her dad, Bob, turned 62 years old today. That's 62 years. For the record, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair would now call up H.R. 5174 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 5174, to amend the Department of Energy Organization Act with respect to functions assigned to assistant secretaries and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5174 to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair now will call up H.R. 5175 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 5175, to require the Secretary of Energy to carry out a program relating to physical security and cybersecurity for pipelines and liquefied natural gas facilities.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is again dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. And the chair will recognize himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5175, offered by Mr. Upton.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the chair is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment. This amendment clarifies that the policies and procedures to coordinate federal agencies, states, and the energy sector includes councils or other entities engaging in sharing, analysis, or sector coordinating. Amendment also clarifies that the Secretary of Energy shall provide technical tools to help the energy sector evaluate, prioritize, and improve physical security and cybersecurity. So, are there any bipartisan amendments to this amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, are there any amendments? Seeing none, if there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. You need a chair. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5175 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair now calls up H.R. 5239 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 5239, to require the Secretary of Energy to establish a voluntary CyberSense program to identify and promote cyber-secure products intended for the use in the bulk power system and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of substitute.
And the clerk will report that amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5239, offered by Mr. Latta.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Mr. Latta is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The amendment in the nature of a substitute of H.R. 5239, the CyberSense Act, makes several changes to clarify the scope of the program under the proposed language. The amendment focuses the intent of the program on testing the cybersecurity of products and technologies for the use in bulk power system. The amendment also ensures that technologies are included in the testing and not only products. These changes reflect technical assistance the committee received from the Department of Energy. The CyberSense program complements and builds upon the DOE program currently under development related to cybersecurity testing, and I would move the amendment and for acceptance.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none. Are there any amendments? Seeing none. If there are no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. If you need a chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature is agreed to. Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5239 is amended to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair now calls up H.R. 5240 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 5240, to provide for certain programs and developments in the Department of Energy concerning the cybersecurity and vulnerabilities of and physical threats to the electric grid and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 5240 to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it, and the ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair calls up H.R. 4606 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4606, to provide that applications under the Natural Gas Act for the importation or exportation of small volumes of natural gas shall be granted without modification or delay.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on... Gentleman from New Jersey strikes the last word. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
As I noted, Mr. Chairman, in my opening, this bill appears to be an attempt to codify the Trump administration proposed rule to expedite the approval of small-scale natural gas exports, and that rule would deem certain lower-volume exports to be non-FTA countries in the public interest, so long as DOE's approval of the application does not require an environmental review under NEPA. And I have a lot of concerns about the Trump rule, but it is a model of restraint compared to this legislation, which would keep DOE's volume limit but completely jettison the requirement that applications qualify for a categorical exclusion from NEPA. The bill also fails to prevent applicants from using this new process to evade the public interest determinations required for large-scale exports by segmenting a large volume gas export into a series of smaller proposals. And as I said earlier, this bill is essentially a legislative earmark. Only one project currently meets the capacity requirements of the administration's small-scale LNG rule, but at the same time does not qualify for a categorical exclusion, and that's a project being developed by Eagle LNG Partners in Jacksonville, Florida. Unless you happen to be an investor in that project, there appears to be no useful purpose to this legislation except to make the Trump administration's policy look enlightened by comparison. And this is legislating at its worst. I mean, I even compare it to a private bill. And I would urge my colleagues to vote against the bill for all these reasons.
Mr. Chairman,
I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
Thank my colleague and ranking member for yielding. Our office has looked at the DOE, and over the years, some of you may remember I wasn't a fan of the DOE and our effort to export LNG, but the DOE's language is much better than in the bill. And it also concerns me that this one exclusion may only impact one company. And I just asked the majority if you would work with us to see how we can, you can go from what the DOE language is instead of the language that's in this bill before we get the markup. And I'll yield back. Thank you.
I yield the time. I guess I still have time to the gentlewoman from Florida.
Well, thank you, Mr. Pallone, and I believe you are correct. And this bill also is not needed. As far as I have heard, there is no backlog right now for the permitting of these type of projects. And it is inappropriate to carve out some special dispensation to a single company per the legislative process. According to the Congressional Research Service, this is the only project that does not merit a categorical exclusion but would still meet the capacity requirements of the small-scale LNG rule. And they say explicitly would be the only current project to benefit from this new expedited process. And I'd also, just a word of caution, if you believe in the importance of liquefied natural gas as part of our energy mix and being able to support it, you don't want to undermine safety standards and environmental standards because then something's going to happen. There's going to be a backlash with greater regulation. It's important to stick with the current process, allow people to have an opportunity to comment, allow the public to have notice, allow for a public interest determination. There's also another problem here. This is kind of masquerading under the term small, but actually there's no limit on the number of small-scale applications an entity could have, and an applicant could skirt requirements for larger exports by breaking a proposal into smaller pieces. There's also a concern we're hearing from manufacturers that this could lead to higher domestic natural gas prices and adversely affect the manufacturing operations and consumers. So for that reason, I agree with Mr. Green. There might be an opportunity to work on something here, but Mr. Pallone is in the end very correct. It is inappropriate to have a bill for a single project. So I'll yield back my time.
And just reclaiming my time with a few seconds remaining, you know, it's just sort of totally hypocritical, in my opinion, to, you know, deem something in the public interest that has avoided all these things. In other words, the whole process is to have some kind of review before you say that this project is in the public interest. And this is just being completely nullified the way this bill sets it up and just says, okay, well, this is clearly in the public interest without having any of these reviews. So I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize Mr. Johnson from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Again, this is about realizing our full economic potential on small-scale LNG technology. It's about what can be accomplished. There is interest and potential in the Caribbean and Central America for American LNG, although not in the large quantities that the current large-scale domestic exporting facilities were built to address. Creating regulatory certainty around small-scale exports can help encourage the industries involved in small-scale technology to move forward with investments and new opportunities. This is especially crucial when you consider that currently in the Caribbean, exporters can only freely ship to the Dominican Republic. Small-scale American LNG can provide the Caribbean and Central America with a stable source of energy, as many are reliant on Venezuelan fuel oil, which has been used to gain influence in the region. As that fuel is displaced, American LNG will help reduce emissions throughout the region, and that's a fact that I think is lost on those who say this bill would gut NEPA. Additionally, renewables can become possible when you have access to American natural gas. This should not be a partisan issue. Former Vice President Biden was a proponent of helping the Caribbean use more clean energy, including natural gas. Recognizing the need for U.S. engagement, the former administration formed the Caribbean Energy Security Initiative. Additionally, U.S. LNG exports to the Caribbean were a recommendation of the first quadrennial energy review undertaken by the Obama administration. Neither side of the aisle can deny that American small-scale LNG provides geopolitical, economic, and environmental benefits. I also think it's important for my colleagues to remember that the Natural Gas Act does not specify an amount threshold for requiring a public interest determination. So projects, whether exporting small or large amounts of natural gas, undergo the same process. In this day and age, when the U.S. has become the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas, and we are projected to become a net energy exporter in just a few short years, I don't think that makes sense. Natural gas production is at an all-time high, and reserves are so large that they are predicted to meet domestic demand for almost a century. And we've already begun to see the enormous benefits of LNG exports at home and abroad. I think it's about time that we better define the Natural Gas Act's involvement in LNG exports within this age of abundance, especially as it relates to small-scale LNG. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this important bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Let me go to Mr. Rush and then Mr. Barton. Strike the last word.
Well, Mr. Chairman, one thank you. I am not able to support H.R. 4606. The bill would amend Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act to consider applications for exports of small-scale volumes of natural gas consisting of 0.14 million cubic feet per day or less to be in the public interest. At first glance, Mr. Chairman, this legislation appears to be an attempt to codify DOE's small-scale LNG rule. However, this bill does not include the requirements that applications must qualify for categorical exclusion from NEPA. This bill, Mr. Chairman, if adopted, would end-run NEPA and allow for future projects to do the same. Mr. Chairman, this is an extraordinary example of proverbial and perpetual carve-out which undercuts and undermines NEPA. Mr. Chairman, according to the CRS, there's really only one project that would meet the requirements underlined in H.R. 4606. The Eagle LNG Partners, Jacksonville, LLC. Mr. Chairman, this seems to me private legislation and a private carve-out rather, and a cop-out from NEPA, and therefore I am absolutely opposed to this bill. And unless someone else want to use my time, then I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, is recognized. Strike the last word.
I appreciate that. I want to ask some questions of the council. I'm not a co-sponsor of this bill. I'm generally aware of it, but I don't really have a dog in the hunt. It seems that the minority concern is that it would affect only one company. Is that true?
The legislation doesn't name any one company specifically. It may be true that there's only one company with an application before DOE at this moment, but it's staff's impression that this legislation is forward-looking and that it could potentially encourage other companies and other applications.
So there may be only one applicant, but there's no prohibition against other applicants if they wanted to comply with this 0.14 billion cubic feet per day limitation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Does the council happen to know what an average natural gas well produces in a day?
It's a good question. I don't have that number in front of me, but what I do have.
I asked Mr. Flores. He's an expert. Mr. Kramer may be. Mr. Green may be. I'm told an average natural gas well in South Texas is about 10 million cubic feet a day. Is that correct?
What I do have is EIA says that on average in 2018 we're expected to produce 81.1 billion.
But that's generic. That's for the whole country. I'm just trying to get how much one average natural gas well, and I should know. But I don't. I think it's 10 million cubic feet a day is a good number.
It varies by basin. It also varies by the by the age of the well. So I don't know that I can give you a number at this point in time. But
well, if it is 10 million cubic feet a day, that'd be 14 gas wells. That's not a lot. So this is obviously small, and if somebody wants to put the capital into building, since it's exporting of LNG, it says natural gas, but to export it, you've got to condense it, you've got to liquefy it, you've got to cool it, so you're going to put quite a bit of money in for not a lot of natural gas to be exported. And if somebody wants to do that, while I understand my minority friends' concern about helping one company, I don't really see that should be a limitation, because if collectively the subcommittee wanted to create a natural gas export company and apply for this, we'd be able to do so because there's no prohibition. So I think we ought to pass the bill and then work with the minority to clarify language at full committee.
If the gentleman will yield, and the clock isn't right, so I just want you to know. If the gentleman will yield, I'm hearing a couple of concerns from all sides. I'm willing to listen to a couple of ideas. I mean, one of the things that particularly a number of us saw when we went down to the Caribbean to look at the hurricane damage, and they still don't have electricity in good parts of it. They're not generating electricity from natural gas. They're using other means that are more expensive, more harmful to the environment, and maybe there are some things that we can do to our friends and neighbors down there. So, I mean, let's, it's a little while before we get to full committee. There are a couple of ideas that I think we can bounce back and forth between the two of us, and I'm willing to listen. So let me just
Chairman, I could reclaim my time briefly. I will say this.
Texas has the time.
I will say this. In some of these Caribbean nations, their primary fuel for generating electricity is fuel oil. Fuel oil is orders of magnitude, like 10 to 15, 20 times more expensive than natural gas.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gentleman, yield.
So if I have time,
you do.
I'll yield to Mr. Green. Looks like we're
I agree with my colleague from Texas that fuel oil, of course, that's where New England gets a lot of their electricity generated from fuel oil, because we can't get a pipeline up there. But
Well, that's a bill in itself, Mr.
yeah, well, we'll fight that battle, and I'll let Joe take care of that. But but there is a need in the Caribbean, in fact, with Puerto Rico, to rebuild their grid and to get them onto something that's much less expensive, and natural gas would be the one. But my concern is that the Department of Energy, and like I said, over the years, I've complained about their export, their slowness in getting export facilities, but they actually have some rules that are addressing this. And I don't know why we would put in statute until we at least see how those rules are working. And that's all I want to do. I want to make sure this is,
It's called
there's an
intent of
environmental
Congress.
process, and
I
don't want to have John Dingell walk into this room and say, we messed with the NEPA process.
Well, I think John Dingell would agree with Mr. Johnson that it's always good for Congress to tell the executive branch what it needs to be.
I don't have any problem with that.
Thank you. Dingell would be for what Mr. Johnson is doing in
Will the
conception.
gentleman yield?
I'm loving this, so I'll be happy to yield. Mr. Rudd, I think
I want the gentleman and others to understand that one of my concerns is the future, you know, and I feel that if we pass this legislation, then you'll have what's to prevent a large project from subdividing to become a smaller project and still end run or subvert NEPA. I don't, you know, so it's not just this project, which I don't see the reason or the rationale for this project, especially in light of what the gentleman.
if I can reclaim my time, I feel very comfortable between now and full committee with Mr. Walden and Mr. Upton. If you've got a NEPA concern, and Mr. Johnson, the co-sponsor, the sponsor of the bill, that's a whole different kettle of fish, but we can address that. I still think it's a good bill to pass at subcommittee.
Would the gentleman yield one more time?
Oh, sure.
Look, the problem that I have is that, you know, this came up the last minute. It was added to a consensus agenda. We had 4 bills. I think what you should do is pull it and let's have an opportunity to see if there's something we can work out. But I mean, at this point, we can't support this. You know, we have to vote no. So it's up, you know, if you figure you want to send it up there and we're going to vote no and you try to work on it between now and then, but I don't even know why we're moving it at all. I mean, the bottom line is it just came up the last minute. We haven't had a chance to really confer with you. Why don't you just pull it and we'll
Well, the bill was introduced on December the 11th.
Yeah.
So
well, it wasn't put on the agenda, though, until the last minute at the time of notice. We weren't notified you were going to put it on.
No, if I just might correct the gentleman, I think we had both the legislative, we had a couple of different hearings on this. This is well known. We pulled the larger one off. This is the smaller one, and I'm willing to entertain some discussions between now and when the full committee marks.
Well, that's fine, but I'm just saying we can't support the bill in its current.
I understand, but I'm just telling the gentleman that we're willing to listen to a couple different ideas that might improve it and may get some of your members on your side to be for it.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further members, additional members wishing to speak? If not, the question occurs on forwarding this bill, H.R. 4606, to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Olson.
Aye.
Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Upton?
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members wishing to vote? Mr. Welch.
Mr. Welch votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 14 noes and 19 ayes.
19 ayes, 14 noes. The bill is passed, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Thank you.